Welcome to the Code Wars. I'm your host, Hugh Simpson. This is the podcast that explores the intersection of technology, power, and the changing nature of conflict. Today we're diving deep into the world of dual-use technology, a sector that's rapidly gaining prominence again as global tensions rise. To guide us through that complex landscape, we have two very special guests, Justin Zeefe and Deborah Fairlamb, the founding partners of Green Flag, a venture capital firm that's at the forefront of investing in Ukraine. Justin, Deborah, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Hugh.
Well, let's get into this. Your mission with Green Flag is to invest in game-changing, early-stage Ukrainian dual-use startups. What was the catalyst for creating Green Flag, and what did you see in the market that was missing that really sort of drove the establishment?
It's a bit of a tough story to put into a nutshell, but at a very high level, I had gone over to Ukraine as a volunteer shortly after the war started. And at the end of my time helping bring medical supplies around the country, I had met a couple of founders who were looking for support as they pivoted their tech company from fintech towards dual use. And having a background both as a founder as well as time in government and the intelligence community, I was well connected and eager to help. And so started making connections and came back to the US, could not get the idea out of my head that this was the next emerging frontier for defense technology, and needed to find a co-founder, somebody who understood the space better than I, in particular on the ground in Ukraine. And that brought me to Deborah, and together we've struck out.
That's fantastic. And Deborah, what brought you into sort of the Green Flag mission, I guess?
So I actually have been living in Ukraine for coming up on 15 years. My background actually is investments, business development, and most of the time that I have spent in Ukraine really has been focused in that nexus. Initially, it was around FDI, so big investments coming in. But I had pivoted over to the tech sector in about 2018 and had really spent the last 6 or so years working with the Ukrainian tech sector as it was continuing to grow. I was working in the cybersecurity space when the war broke out, and just like everybody else in the tech sector, and to what Justin alluded to, there's this incredible pivot from all of these super smart tech guys from traditional tech over to dual use, and it was largely in response to what was needed out at the front. And so that was my pivot. And when Justin and I were introduced, we have very different backgrounds, but they're extremely complementary for what we're doing. And the more important thing was we both had both saw the opportunity and had a really united vision about how to go about approaching it and what we could do with the fund.
Can you give us a bit of a snapshot of where Green Flag is today? What stage of the capital raise for your fund are you, and how many investments have you made?
Sure. So we are a U.S.-based fund. We are investing, as you said, in Ukrainian-founded dual use, although the actual investments that we make are into legal entities that these Ukrainian companies establish outside of Ukraine. So all of our investments are actually made into either European or U.S. jurisdictions. Thus far, we have made 5 announced investments. There is another one that is pending that will be announced very shortly. We have a very robust pipeline. The problem, here is not in terms of companies to take a look at. We are still fundraising, but we will be closing our fund to new investors at the end of October. So we're kind of in the last stage of doing the fundraise, and at that point we will have full time being able to devote to building out the portfolio. Up until now, we've been doing a raise deploy strategy. And we had chosen to do that just as a way to start demonstrating some of the things that we were seeing. And actually, this strategy has paid off because we've been able to really highlight some of the companies we've invested in thus far. And it's also given us the ability to sort of talk to a broader audience about what's happening here, because I do think that an awful lot of people really don't understand the degree to which technology changes are really driving how war is being fought. And these Ukrainian companies are both literally and metaphorically on the front line of all of this. And in the context of not only supporting these companies in Ukraine, but helping to share this story with partners and allies in the West, that is also something we've really been able to do through this platform or through this fund, and the ability to talk to people. And so we consider that as an important component of what we're doing as well.
Yeah, that's always the challenge when you are starting a new fund is, do you raise the money, then build your pipeline and bring in your portfolio investments? So doing it at the same time does give you that added advantage. But I mean, what we're also seeing here is a growth in the European and the US defense tech and also dual use ecosystem. Yeah, I myself am ex-military, and I am absolutely shocked and amazed at how quickly the technology has changed a shape that I know. Well, I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago deployed, and it's just changed so much, and will continue to change.
I was just going to say, on that point, there's the rapid iteration of the technology is really one of the defining features that people need to understand. There's a couple things that really sort of stand out. So one, the use of drones, and everybody knows Ukraine drones, but what people really don't understand is the degree to which they are being used. When you are right on the front line, and even the 20 kilometers off the front line, to a very large degree, small FPVs and kamikaze drones have replaced bullets and artillery. That is
Mm.
actually how much the smaller drones have taken this, moved forward in this ecosystem. But then you add in the addition of the tremendous electronic warfare that the Russians have been deploying, which means that something that you built and was working a week ago, this week actually may not work anymore unless you swap out the antennas, you do some changes to the connection board, and then in order to be able to sort of respond to whatever the changes that the Russians are doing. Another thing is there is extremely heavy GPS denial. And one of the real challenges that we've seen is a lot of the Western tech that comes into Ukraine was not built for a GPS denied electronic warfare environment. And so it doesn't work. It literally doesn't fly here within some of these conditions. And so, in the context of the Western tech that is being built out, and it keeping pace with what the Russians continue to evolve and to change with, there is still a gap, and that the only one filling that gap at this moment are the Ukrainians out on the front.
Are you seeing sort of an awakening in the European defense space or the US defense space around these issues, or is it still being a bit slow to sort of take to it?
No, I think that there is an awakening, although we are now 3.5 years into the war, and so I still think it's somewhat crazy that it's taken this long. Things are happening at a slightly different pace in the U.S. and Europe. The U.S., the Secretary of Defense Hegseth came out with an order just earlier this week that not only are they looking at kind of the bigger fixed-wing long-range drones, that there is now a focus and an emphasis on the FPVs for use on the front line, and talking about trying to start getting these into the hands of U.S. soldiers in coming months, just to let them start practicing and understanding not only how to use the drones, because it's not just a drone in a box and it's going to work. You really have to understand the training that goes into this. These things are actually not easy to fly. Then you have to build in, so there's the training component. And then you have to build in the tactics, the strategy. How do the units work together? How does one unit work with the second unit? How is their coordination? So there is this whole process that everybody's going to have to go through, that they're just getting started on in the U.S. I don't actually see that unity across the European Union, nor truthfully across NATO quite yet. There are certainly countries that are talking about upping their defense spending, and they certainly are. But for example, Germany 2 weeks ago came out and said they were buying, 8,500 new tanks and APVs. And quite frankly, those really aren't going to last out on the front line very long, because again, going back to just the entire nature of this war has changed so much. So they're still working through the learning curve and trying to figure out exactly how they're going to start ramping up.
I mean, yeah, we saw the NATO increase to 5% or 3.5% of direct spending, and the rest out of sort of this loosely aligned critical national infrastructure and defence type spending. We won't know exactly what that means for each of the nations that signed up to it. Maybe Justin, with you going around trying to fundraise for this for the fund, what have you seen around the venture capital sentiment and how that's shaping across the defence sector, Europe, but also the US?
It's an interesting dynamic right now. Venture capital is either at or just coming out of a 14-year low for capital raised, as well as activity within venture capital, because the markets are backed up. Right, a lot of the investor dollars that went into venture over the last decade, which anticipated, exits via IPO and liquidity and opportunities to reinvest, have been stalled. And so there is both reticence to put more capital to work within venture, and then add to that, the additional risk presented by the optics, at least, of investing in defense or in dual use, and a general, I would say, not just sector wide, but society wide misunderstanding of, or lack of agreement on, what is dual use versus defense capability. Is there a difference? And then, if there is, what is that difference? To us, dual use is technology that has clear and compelling commercial, civil, and military applications in the near term, not some conceptual application in the future. And when you look at the sector that way, it reduces a fair amount of the risk, opens up a fair amount of addressable market. And we're seeing more investor interest in that space than in any other.
And when you're talking to LPs, is it the ESG side of the dual use that they're sort of worried about, or is it just returns?
I mean, if you're putting capital into venture, you shouldn't be anticipating returns on in a less than a 7 to 10 year cycle, right? It's a long term asset play, uh, where typically, or at least very frequently, it has been designed around returning the fund by hoping that you have secured a unicorn investment out of your portfolio, and that you can have 9 out of those 10 investments fail and one succeed. This is a different sector where it's rather important that, not the wrong technologies are not funded and waste everybody's time, but also that people are willing to take a bit more risk and put capital to work in places where there are regulatory hurdles to overcome, and questions about, ethics of how those capabilities might be deployed in the future. I think it's time to stop uh, dilly dallying, and understand that this is a need to protect one's sovereignty. And if you can't do that, it really doesn't matter what your perspective is on the market, because it's going to be, commandeered, and you'll be told what the market is. So you have to be willing to spend the capital to defend your society. And I think we are seeing an increase in that, in interest in doing that.
That's really interesting, especially in Europe, because of that sort of lull in defence spending over a number of years. What have you seen as some of the specific challenges that a lot of these companies are facing as they, shift to their dual use from just Ukraine, but also dual use across Europe and US?
So I'll sort of tackle that at 2 points. I mean, there's actually problems with the money supplies, because if you kind of think about how the bigger market structures work, especially in certain areas, the international financial institutions, EBRD, IFC, World Bank, they are all regulatorily constricted from investing in defense. So the very big top lenders in the world don't invest in this space. And then you go further down the chain, you go to the developmental financial institutions, then the pension funds, and then private equity, and then all the way down to VC, kind of down this funnel. And there's some very big barriers at the top. And so that also is, to your point, what is impacting some of the constrictions within banking that people are seeing. So it's not a quick fix. It's literally a reflection of the mindset for the last 80 years where there was this peace dividend and everybody thought war was over, and it was a very different situation. So there are some structural things that I think need to be sort of worked through. In terms of barriers, if you think about who a traditional purchaser for this, it's going to be a Defense Department or a Ministry of Defense. And if you think to the past, who were the ones who were the defense folks selling into these industries, it was always the big prime. So it was the BAEs and Lockheeds and the Boeings and across both Europe as well as in the United States. And these are enormous institutions with huge amounts of money. The procurement systems that were set up, the purchase, processes, often, it can take years to actually get into the pipeline or into the point where you are able to get a purchase order from the DoD or MODs. For a startup who is going to be bootstrapping or tight on capital, to wait 3 to 5 years to be able to sell into the prime buyer within the market is a huge hurdle. That is, and just as a quick aside, in addition to the points Justin talked about in terms of dual use, one of the reasons that you really need secondary applications from our perspective is really kind of a business strategy. Because if your one main client is going to take 3 to 5 years to make a decision and work you through their pipeline, you need other sources of revenue in the meantime. And so that's kind of an aside, but it's one of the things that we look at. So the sort of long haul, crossing the valley of death, selling into an MOD or a DoD is a big issue, not just for startups coming out of Ukraine, but for startups in Europe and across the United States. It's a sort of a systemic issue. And I think that there are going to have to be changes in the procurement processes, both at a country level and potentially at NATO level as well, to be able to start adapting this technology up and in. Because to the point that I made earlier, literally there are changes that are happening on a weekly basis on the battlefront. If you're not buying a technology, it started here and you're not buying it for 5 years, you are 5 years late to the game. And so there has to be changes for that level as well. And I think that's something that both call it the Pentagon, general staff, various army branches, in conjunction with the procurement agencies, which is often at the government level where the money is actually released. They're going to have to make some serious structural changes, and I think that those are issues that people are starting to recognize, but I have not seen substantial movement whatsoever in addressing how they're going to address, how they're going to be able to absorb this new tech in and up quickly enough for it to make a difference.
I was just going to add the procurement cycles, one side of the coin. The other is the speed with which innovation is taking place on the battlefield. And, you put those two things together, and it's not just a matter of waiting 5 years for your equipment. It's a matter of to Deborah's point, that the equipment you're going to receive in 5 years will be woefully inadequate and may not even be addressing a problem that you have, right? So you have to be more agile and also recognize, at least from our perspective, that there are artificial market demands, right? So Ukraine needs as many drones in the air as it can get. The addressable market worldwide does not need as many drone companies as can be created, right? Not everything that is worthy of investment and financial support in furtherance of returns is that if it's in that category, does not mean that it is venture backable, right? There may be other financial instruments that are more appropriate for supporting the growth of that company. If you do not have, at least from our perspective, right, we're a venture capital firm. If we fail, it will be because we did not adhere to the most basic of requirements of investing in venture as an asset class, which is to ensure that we're putting our capital behind things that we believe can scale and that have large addressable markets, and where we can, true to the point of scaling, right, produce more for equal amounts or less capital on the back end. And that drone main airframes are not necessarily, the best place to put your capital uh, when they are commoditized. But still, they need as many of those in the air, but that doesn't mean that venture should be the mechanism by which they're funded.
I mean, on that, how do you sort through the sort of the chaff as you go through looking at all the various startups that come to you? Because I imagine, what is it? Brave One has over 700 had over 700 different startups. How do you sort through that to find the ones that have both a fit in Ukraine, but also that larger addressable market?
I'll speak to the fit in Ukraine part at least. It's usually pretty clear, right? If you're working with Brave One, typically speaking, you are either on the battlefield, actively engaged in R&D or deployment to the front, or you are working towards that and very close to it. From our perspective, we are a $20 million fund. We are not here to boil the ocean, right? We can pick a select number of companies that we have high confidence that between the advisors that will attach to those companies who are coming from, the tops of their respective career fields, to the access we have to the buying centers, both civil, commercial, and government, military around the world, we can make pretty smart bets fairly early on. And then it's just a question of, from the diligence process, does what appear to be reality in fact reality? Or is what appears to be reality in fact reality? And in some cases it isn't, and in many cases it is. And we look for companies that are, if you're familiar with the TRL concept of technology readiness level, that's what we use as a matrix for whether or not a company is meets our uh, profile of what we're looking for, rather than referring back to the stage of investment that they hold themselves out to be, because the concepts of pre-seed, seed, and post-seed have lost any and all objective basis in reality for what they mean. Now that you have companies who are raising pre-seed and they're generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue, like what is pre-seed exactly? So we look for things that are TRL 6 plus, where they've actively deployed capabilities to the battlefield, either in testing or in actual live combat scenarios. And that does limit the pool of available companies for us to look at, but not in any way is it too small for us to be able to cull through and reject a majority of what we see.
Another thing I think that's important and that sort of distinguishes Green Flag from in just the way that we are doing things. I am here on the ground. Justin is in Ukraine several times a year, and we are very actively engaged in the ecosystem. And so we are constantly in touch with a variety of companies that are here. We talk to the military. We get actually a lot of insight, not just through Brave One, but for others in the ecosystem who said, hey, this company, they've got a great team. They've just done something really neat with with their tech. You've got to go have a conversation with them. So a lot of it is just the work of going out and talking to people. This morning I was in a field about an hour north of Kiev watching, two new drones from a company that I just took a look at. And it was really interesting because I had seen their presentation, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And in just looking at the paper, it was a little bit hard to distinguish. But when I got out there and saw what they have done through a combination of actually software and hardware, I was blown away by what they've done. Actually, I've not seen it with anybody else in this ecosystem. And so it's literally sorting the wheat from the chaff is work. You just get out and you do it. And that is very much what we're doing right here.
I mean, you being on the ground, Deborah, is fantastic. Are you seeing many other sort of VCs and investors in this space getting boots on the ground?
So we're seeing the evolution of it a little bit. For the first year that we were here, there were some Ukrainian firms that were investing. There is a Finnish firm that is here, boots on the ground. There are 2 other ones that are US aligned that have people on the ground here. Um, but it was a really small world for a while, of people that are here. There are a couple that are tangentially here and that we have been working with. It's a funny thing and sort of contrarian to what people might think of VC, but because there is so much here, there are so many good companies and so few VCs that it's actually a very cooperative ecosystem as opposed to a competitive one. And so everybody who is here, we all know each other. If somebody knows, if they're doing an investment and there is room left over in the round, we will just call around and say, hey, this is who we're investing in. We've got this space, would you be interested in joining the round? And so it's been actually a really nice ecosystem in that context. That said, there is so much more room for more capital in this ecosystem. I think last year it was about $65 million that went into the Ukrainian tech ecosystem. European tech ecosystem had more than €1 billion. US had more than 3 billion. So the disparity between the money that is coming into this ecosystem and what is more or less chasing returns from a very small handful of companies in Europe and then in the US, just because those companies already have direct sort of access into the DoD or the MODs, you can see the schism of where investors are falling and who is doing we're just chasing the returns versus the ones who are really looking at this ecosystem, understanding the changes that are happening, understanding where this is going, and have the longer term vision of, yes, there will be returns down the road, but we also see where this technology is taking us down the road. So there is still a vast gulf between those who kind of understand what's going on here and those who are just chasing, the quick returns in other markets.
What would be some of the advice that you'd give to sort of those VCs or investors coming into Ukraine or looking at Ukrainian businesses in the dual use space?
My first one would be, this is not investing in fintech or SaaS. And at the end of the day, you have to remember that soldiers' lives are on the line. And if you are not serious about supporting companies that are really making a difference, this probably isn't a space for you. Sorry, but it's true. Second thing is, you really do want to understand if the companies that you are investing in can deliver on what they're promised. There's lots of companies that look really sexy and have really nice marketing brochures. But again, do you want to be backing a company that is going to sell a product into a Ministry of Defense that has not been proven and that is not going to bear out and support soldiers when they're actually on the field? It really helps for VCs to have, especially if you don't have deep experience in this space, to have military advisors or people who actually do understand who the user is going to be as opposed to just the buyer, because the kind of technology, there's been this shift towards kind of exquisite and very fancy and these things. That's not what soldiers need. Soldiers need rugged, waterproof, 2 clicks of, down a screen to bring up whatever information they're bringing up. They really need to have military experience to help them kind of look through some of this space as well, just to understand what from the perspective of who is actually going to be using this. I don't know, Justin, you have maybe other views?
I mean, you started off the question talking about the emerging or nascent or re-emerging defense capabilities for Europe. I think it's important to point out that there may be an advantage there, right? Like, because it's so fresh and has to restart, it can avoid a lot of the processes and quagmires that exist, like in the US system, where the rewards and incentives are designed for companies that are building, $50 million systems that, are mounted on the back of a tracked 18 wheeler that takes 10 years to develop and is relatively lacking in its real time adaptability to adversarial capability. Whereas Europe does not have as much of a problem with that. Most of the companies that are coming online now that we suspect will be, winners in the future are the ones that are building highly adaptable, modular, inexpensive, attritable, high volume in terms of quantity, low volume in terms of the amount of space that they occupy on the battle space, right? And so I would say we anticipate over the near term there will be more winners coming out of Europe, assuming the deregulation efforts are enough to encourage founders to actually spend time growing a company and not worry that 75% of their gains are going to be taken through taxes. But we do see the fairly rapidly growing defense tech sector in Europe.
So what we might do now is just shift focus towards some of the portfolio companies that you have in Green Flag. There's obviously a number of them. We're not planning to go through all of them, but two that really come to mind: Swarmer AI, but also Keradag. Also, I think would be a really interesting one. But maybe there's some others that you guys can talk about how they're being used in Ukraine, but also what are their dual-use applications just outside the Ukrainian theater.
Deb, you want to talk about Swarmer and I'll talk about CareDag?
Yeah, so Swarmer is so if you take the word swarm, there's lots of different use cases. So you can think about like the Chinese displays at the Olympics where there's 1,000 drones up in the air. Those are all kind of pre-computer programmed. They're all working off of GPS and it's all very lovely and there's not interference. If you're talking about sort of the way that swarming capabilities are being discussed more on the battlefield, what you're actually getting down to is the concept of maybe one operator, multiple drones, because what that really does is sort of helps in terms of the expanding the use cases for using drones going out and the number of people involved. There's a much better ratio, obviously. So what Swarmer is doing is working towards having single operator but multiple drones working together in concert. They are doing it without GPS, and they are in the process of developing the capabilities and actually have, it's not in the process of, they're actually testing and in use out on the battlefield of so you have the operator, there is a pre-programmed target set in, and then there's not just communication between the operator and the drones, but there's actually drone communication as well.
The force multiplier element of it is really important, but it's also important to consider. We always talk about removing the human in what we call the kill chain, but it's not just a kill chain. Not every objective or strategic operation is designed to destroy something, right? And I realize that we use kill chain in this sense to talk about really any activity that an autonomous object may be authorized to conduct, but it can be as simple as you have an observation mission, right, where you're sending 20 drones out to take photographs of 15 different places. You also are sending these drones into a high threat environment, both kinetic as well as electronic warfare, right, from a denial perspective, either because you're shooting it out of the sky or because you're jamming the frequencies. And in this case, removing the human from the kill chain really just means enabling the drone to enabling the swarm of drones to decide which among the drones in that swarm is best suited to conduct X element of the operation. And if that drone is taken out of the sky, literally, another drone can say, okay, this operation can no longer be undertaken by the drone that was just knocked out of the sky. It will retask that effort to another drone, whatever the programming tells it to do, and it can do that autonomously. So it's not just a force multiplier, but it also enables rapid, if not near instantaneous, decision making regarding mission fulfillment, even when that's not kinetic.
I mean, thinking about that, I've got my mind is racing around what are the civilian applications that you could also do with this. But what are some of those use cases that you've discussed with the portfolio?
Well, I mean, some of the more basic would be construction. It could be sending out a swarm of drones to do inspections on a facility or a ship or an oil rig. A lot of this is already done now, but if you can simply just say, here are your objectives, and you send out five drones and just let them do the work, they will come back with a more efficient plan for execution than a human typically is going to be able to generate. But B, it saves tons and tons of man hours because the individuals, the operators, don't need to be worrying about sending which drone to which part of the facility. They can simply say, here is the overall objective. You sort this out, and it can do that. It can be used for, to Deborah's earlier reference around, replacing fireworks shows with, giant dragons that are swooping through the sky. Those drones need to be able to speak to one another to know, hey, this is the direction we need to go. Let's not knock into one another. Well, I mean, imagine one of those drones has a faulty rotor and smacks into another drone, and in a scenario where those drones are unable to operate in a quasi-autonomous fashion, they may just have absolutely no idea, A, that something has happened, and B, how to respond to that, whereas a swarm of drones already has a plan and how to execute that. And in many ways, you can think of it as like an anthill, right? Like the ants are coordinating when they're going out to do something. It doesn't look like it necessarily from our perspective, but they're very distinctly passing pheromones back and forth and have very clear lines of communication and can operate as a single entity, even though it's a mass of individuals.
And the data being collected as well, would that also be shared across the various platforms at the edge? So if you lost one drone, you don't lose all the data that you've captured off that drone.
Yeah, data sharing it can be complicated in the environment if you're operating in a denied environment, because you may want to have you may want to go radio silent and not be communicating anything, right? But there's always you can even go the old school route of having flashing UV lights, which can communicate via Morse code, right? You're not going to pick that up from an EW perspective. So there are ways to communicate. It's environment dependent.
It's probably a good segue to Caradag, the counter-UAS system that you were talking about before. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Caradag was, I believe, the first official investment Green Flag made. Caradag is the founder of Caradag is a Ukrainian U.S. dual sit. Master's degrees from a lot of U.S. institutions and a lot of time in Silicon Valley. It was a great first test case for us to demonstrate value and make the argument to our investors that there's where you can dip your toe, right, and get acclimated to the environment. What Caradag does is it's this device right here, right? It's about I have a standard iPhone 14. It's about the same size, not the same thickness, but same size. This is a device that a soldier can put in their pocket. And what it does, it's got multiple antennas. It's a lighting system, connects to a video screen or to your watch or whatever receiver you have with you. Lets you know when there is a drone in the air, what type of drone it is, what its airspeed, heading, vector, altitude, etc. are. Enables you to jam that drone, intercept the video, and most critically, these operate in a mesh environment, a mesh network, which means if you've got a unit of 20 soldiers and 7 of these have them in their pockets, if those 7 soldiers are configured in the right way around the unit, you can create an envelope that protects the entire unit or the unit's equipment. And what we love about this is, of course, it's got clear military application, also has clear civilian and commercial application, right? They have a version that can go on your vehicle. This could be used for anti-paparazzi reasons or for security details who are concerned about, drones.
Gatwick Airport a few years ago when they had the drone flying.
Or the Port of Los Angeles. All of these places, like there was, a year ago or less year ago, people were, the news cycles were awash with people concerned about unidentified UAS flying over New Jersey or wherever. One of the major issues that Tesla had quite a few years ago when there was a big short and distort effort were drones flying over their production facilities to try and count the number of vehicles that were being produced because they could place bets on that and short that information. So there's a lot of applications commercially and civilly as well. But what we really like about Caradag, and I think is really worth a mention, is what they've really built as a platform, right? We're entering an era, not entering, we have entered an era where AI is increasingly efficient and effective and disruptive. And I personally worry that an investment made today in something that is AI adjacent cannot survive a venture capital cycle of growing over a period of 3 to 5 years and aiming for an exit. There's too much evolution happening too quickly to align with a traditional 6 or 7 year cycle like that. But what Caradag has built is a platform, right? And to Deborah's point earlier about data being critical, uh, their platform is the world's largest repository of drone signature information, both electronic and acoustic. And so if you are somebody at a port or at Gatwick, and you want not just to know when a drone is flying overhead, but where has that type of drone been seen before? How many of those drones have been known to operate together? Where else in the world have they been seen? That's a data question. That's not a technology question, right? And so by building that back-end database, Caradag has now become the database of record, where if you need to have any concerns around counter drone activities, you're going to need access to their platform because it's what all of the other systems around the world are starting to rely on. And that from going back to the earlier point around, what is and isn't venture backable and where is technology going and how quickly, having a platform like that creates a static point that everybody is going to need to refer back to, and you cannot prompt engineer your way or create synthetic data sufficient to overtake the value of the actual data that they have. Because if I'm querying that system for data, it's because I'm looking for the actual data. When was this actual type of drone last seen? Not what would it look like if this kind of drone was seen, right? Which would be synthetic data. So they've, every new customer who onboards with the capability increases the depth and breadth of their competitive moat as well as their intellectual property moat. Long answer, I'm sorry, but really excited about this one.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm just sort of thinking about all the other use cases you could potentially do with it, and I think that's something that I'm going to take away from today, but also hopefully people listening will also take away that, yes, you're applying a lot of these startups and a lot of this technology in Ukraine, but thinking about that broader civilian and non-military application is also at the forefront of your mind.
I mean, it has to be, right? Like, we're a venture capital firm. Our objective is to pick the companies that we feel we can help grow and grow them as best as we can and exit them and, do right by our fiduciary obligation to our investors as well as the obligation to the ecosystem that we're supporting. And we wouldn't be doing that if we invested in things that we didn't actually believe that we could scale and take to market, right? So this is not an impact fund. This is a fund designed to return significant multiples to our investors. And when we feel that this is an ecosystem that's producing tons and tons of companies that can do that, and it's just a matter of picking the right ones.
Fantastic. Well, I've taken up a lot of your time today. Thank you very much. I mean, it's been really an eye-opening discussion around the VC space, but also specifically as it relates to investing into Ukrainian businesses, which I think everyone needs to do a little bit more, not only in this sector, but also across the board. So thank you very much for being with us today and for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Hugh.
Thanks for having us, Hugh.
Thank you everyone for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, remember to like, subscribe and share on wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to join us in the conversation on Instagram, Threads and Substack. Until next time, I'm your host Hugh Simpson, and you've been listening to The Code Wars, your podcast that explores the intersection of technology, power and the changing nature of conflict.